Oak. Orchestrated new frontier narrative with original characters and plot structure. Orchestrated new frontier narrative with original characters and plot structure. Oak. By the third night, the cold had stopped behaving like cold. It no longer bit. It pressed, the way water presses on a body that has stopped fighting the river, and Tabitha Hale had begun to understand that this was the dangerous part. Not the shivering which had kept her children alive for 2 days, but the quiet that came after it stopped. Oak. She held her youngest against her breastbone and counted the small breaths because counting was the only prayer she had left. Outside the sagging canvas, the wind worked at the seams like a thing with fingers. The fire was 3 coals and a curl of smoke. Somewhere past the lean-to, in the dark where the lodgepole stood in ranks, something large was moving in slow circles, and her oldest had heard it before she had. Oak. Then the canvas tore open, and a shape filled the gap that was bigger than any door, fur and shoulder and the smell of wood smoke and animal grease, and a voice came down out of it that was lower than the wind. Oak. You won't die out here tonight, the shape said. Not while I've got a roof up that hill. Oak. It was the winter of 1886, in the high cold country under the crazy mountains, where the Shields River froze along its edges and the snow came early and stayed mean, and Tabitha Hale was 24 years old and had buried her husband 91 days before. Oak. Daniel had been a fence and fields man, not a fighter. He'd come up from Missouri with a wagon, a milk cow, and a head full of careful plans, and he'd filed on a quarter section in the Shields Valley that everyone but Daniel said was worthless. It sat at the mouth of a side canyon, all rock and scrub, and the one thing it had, the only thing, was a spring that ran clear and steady straight through the worst of August, when every other creek in the basin pulled back into its bed and died. Oak. Daniel had seen the value in that water before he'd seen anything else. So had Augustus Greaves. Oak. Greaves ran cattle on the open range from the foothills clear to the river, more head than any man could honestly count, and he ran the bank in town, and he owned the freight contracts, and he owned, people said quietly, the 2 men who passed for the law in that part of the territory. A man with that much did not need one rocky quarter section and a spring. But Greaves was the kind of man for whom need and want had long ago stopped being different words. Oak. The valley was a glove, and the Hale Spring was the one place the glove didn't quite close. In a dry year, and dry years came, whoever held that water held every herd that had to drink. Oak. Daniel said no the first time, and the second, and Greaves smiled both times and said there was no hurry, winters being long and a man's mind being free to change. Oak. In October, Daniel rode up the canyon to check his line and didn't come back by dark. Tabitha found him at first light with the children left sleeping and the baby strapped to her, found him at the bottom of a shale slope with his horse standing patient nearby and his neck broken clean. The county man came out, looked for the length of time it takes to roll a cigarette, and wrote it down as a fall. Horses spook, he said. Slopes give. It was a shame, he said, about the children. Oak. Tabitha did not believe a single word of it, and she had her reasons. But a woman's certainty is not evidence, and evidence was exactly the thing she could not find. Daniel had kept records. He kept records of everything, weather and weight, and the price of nails. And in the last weeks before he died, he had taken to keeping something else. Something he wrote at night with the lamp turned low and did not let her read. When it's done, he'd told her, when it's safe, I'll show you all of it. Oak. There's a man at the land office in Livingston who'll know what to do with it. She had asked him what it was. He'd put his hand over hers, and he'd said, It's the thing that keeps us. Don't you worry over it, Oak. And then he was dead, and whatever he'd been writing was gone. Not in his coat, not in his saddlebags, not in the cabin, gone. And 3 weeks after the funeral, Greaves came to the door himself, with a paper that said Daniel had borrowed against the land and never paid, and gave her until spring to settle or sign. Oak. She might have signed. She had thought about it in the worst of the nights. But on the 4th week, the bank's man rode out and stood in her yard and said, idle as weather, that it'd be a pity if the children were to end up wards of the county, what with their mother proving unfit, a widow alone with no means, and that Mr. Greaves was a charitable man who'd see they were placed somewhere they could earn their keep. Oak. That was the morning Tabitha understood that signing would not save them. She loaded what the wagon would carry and pointed the mule north toward her cousin's place above the Musselshell. 2 hard days off, because 2 days felt better than waiting in that yard for the men to come back. She knew it was a fool's run with the season turning. She did it anyway, The way you'll run from a fire even into the dark, because the fire is the thing that's certain. Oak. The storm caught them on the second afternoon, where the trail climbed out of the valley into the timber under the crazies. The mule went lame in the rocks, and then the snow came down so thick the world closed to an arm's length. And Tabitha did the only thing left to do, which was to cut the camps off the wagon boughs, and rig a lean-to against a deadfall, and put her 3 children behind her body and wait. Oak. The oldest was Pearl, 10, with her father's seriousness in her small face, who had taken to holding the broken handle of the wagon jack like a club and would not be talked out of it. Then Asa, 6, who had stopped asking questions on the first day, which frightened Tabitha more than any amount of crying. Oak. And the baby Lottie, just past 2, who slept too much now, wrapped in the gray wool blanket Tabitha had pieced herself before the girl was born and had not let out of her hands since the funeral. Oak. By the 3rd night, the firewood was gone, and the dried meat was gone, and the cold had begun its quiet pressing, and Tabitha had stopped lying to the children about the storm passing by morning, and she had heard the heavy circling steps in the dark, and had taken the jack-handle gently out of Pearl's hands. Oak. Wolves. Oak. She knew them by the way they moved. Patient, unhurried, working the edges, the way a thing moves when it knows it has all night and you have none. There were several. She could not see them. She could only feel the gaps of silence in the wind where they crossed, and once, close, the low complaint deep in a chest that means a beast has decided. The lame mule was picketed 20 feet off, and the mule knew too. It had been screaming for an hour, and then it had gone terribly quiet. Oak. When the first one hit the canvas, it came through the side, not the front, a gray weight slamming the wall in and a snap of teeth in the dark, and Asa shrieking, and Tabitha swinging the iron handle at a shape she couldn't see, and feeling it land on something solid that yelped and was gone. Oak. She got her back to the deadfall and the children behind her, and she stood in the torn mouth of the lean, 2 with the handle raised, breathing in great heaves, ready to die loudly enough to buy them another minute, because a minute was the only currency she had any of. Oak. That was when the man came up the slope out of the snow. Oak. He didn't shout. He didn't shoot, not at first. He came through the curtain of snow at a dead walk with a pine knot torch, streaming fire in one hand, and a long whip uncoiling from the other, and he put himself between the canvas and the dark, and he cracked that whip once, twice, the sound going off like rifle shots in the muffled night. The shapes at the edge of the firelight flinched back. Oak. He thrust the torch low, swinging the flame in a hissing arc across the snow, and he made a sound, not a yell, a roar, something that came up out of him and rolled down the slope and answered the wolves in their own register. And Tabitha watched the gray shapes break and slide back into the timber and dissolve. Oak. Then it was only the wind, and the man standing huge and still, listening, the torch throwing his shadow up across the trees twice his size. Oak. He turned around slow. Under a frost-caked hat his face was all weather and dark beard, and his eyes were a pale gray that caught the firelight, and they went past her to the children, to the baby in the bundle, to the boy too quiet, to the girl with her fists balled, and something moved across that hard face that she would only later understand had been recognition. Not of her, of the situation. Oak. Put the iron down, ma'am, he said. The voice was lower than she'd thought a voice could be and gone oddly gentle. I'm not the worst thing on this mountain, not by a long way. Oak. She did not put it down. Who are you? Oak. He looked past her at the dead fire, the empty tins, the blue cast to the little boy's lips. He did not answer that question. He answered the one underneath it. Name's Silas Mercer. I trapped this country. He nodded uphill into the dark. I've got a cabin a half-mile up, dry and warm. That, he tipped his head at the wolves' dark, is a winter pack run thin, and they'll be back inside the hour, and they'll be braver. That canvas won't stop the next push. He let that sit. Your boy's near froze. Oak. I can carry him. Oak. We don't know you, Tabitha said. Her voice came out cracked. I was run out of the valley by men who smiled at me. I won't be led off into the dark by another one. Oak. Silas Mercer looked at her a long moment. Snow gathered on the shoulders of his coat, and then he did a strange thing. He crouched down, slow, until he was below her eye line, the way you'd lower yourself in front of a frightened horse, and he set the torch upright in the snow between them so the fire was a wall she could see him through. Oak. I lived 15 winters up here on my own account, he said, because I'd had my fill of men who smile. I came down tonight to run that pack off my trap line, not to find a family freezing in their own canvas. I don't much want the trouble of you, ma'am, and that's God's truth. But I'm not going to walk back up that hill and listen to it happen. He stood. You can come or you can stay. The cold doesn't care which, and neither do those wolves. But your young ones do. Oak. It was the boy who decided it. Asa, who had not spoken since the morning before, slid out from behind his mother's leg and walked straight to the big man and lifted his arms to be carried, the way a child does who has run out of fear and has only tiredness left. Silas looked down at him. For one breath he didn't move. Then he bent and scooped the boy up and folded him into the bearskin against his chest, and Asa put his cold face against the fur and shut his eyes. Oak. The children trusted him before their mother did. Tabitha would remember that her son chose first and chose right, and that some part of her followed her own child up that mountain because the boy had seen something she was too frightened to look at. Oak. She dropped the jack handle in the snow. Oak. The half-mile was the longest walk of her life. Silas broke trail with Asa in one arm and the torch in the other, and he came back twice for Pearl when the drifts went over the girl's hips, and Tabitha came last with Lottie strapped tight and the storm shoving at her like it had a grudge. Just when her legs had gone to wood and the warm, sleepy nothing of the cold was creeping into her thinking, an orange square of light swam up through the timber. Oak. The cabin was not the prospector shack she'd pictured. It was built low and heavy against a rock face. Logs as thick as a man's chest, chinked tight with moss and clay. The roof carrying a good 2 feet of snow that the warmth from within had not yet melted through. And she noticed that, the snow on the roof, in the dim animal way of an exhausted mind, and it told her the place was solid, the heat staying down where it belonged. Oak. Silas put his shoulder to a slab door, and they fell into a wall of warmth that hurt. Oak. A stone fireplace took up half of one wall, banked low and breathing red. Bundles of dried herbs and strings of dark smoked meat hung from the rafters. There were furs racked and folded, a heavy table, a cot, everything spare and squared away, and clean in the manner of a man who has only himself to answer to. To Tabitha, stumbling, it was a cathedral. Oak. Silas set Asa down on a bear hide by the hearth and went straight to work without ceremony. He fed the fire up till it threw real heat. He tossed wool blankets at them and turned his back to give them privacy, while Tabitha stripped the frozen clothes off her children and wrapped their gray-white limbs in the rough, warm wool and chafed feeling back into small feet. Oak. He swung a cast-iron pot onto the coals, and inside 10 minutes the cabin smelled of marrow and salt, and he was ladling broth into tin cups and pressing them into Tabitha's hands before he'd taken anything for himself. Oak. Lottie wouldn't take it. She only turned her face away and slept that heavy, frightening sleep. Silas crouched, laid the back of 2 thick, scarred fingers against the baby's cheek, then her chest, listening. Oak. Cold's deep in her, he said. Not gone too far. We warm her slow. Slow, not fast, you hear me. Not next to the fire, against your own skin, under the blankets, and we get a little of this into her a spoon at a time when she'll take it. He handed Tabitha a smaller cup, cooler. Your skin'll do more than my fire will. Oak. Tabitha unlaced her dress and held her daughter against her bare warm chest under the wool. The way, Silas said, and rocked, and sometime in the next hour, the baby stirred and made a small cross sound and turned her head and rooted. And Tabitha put her face down into the small dark hair and wept so hard and so silently that her whole body shook with it, and Silas Mercer turned away and pretended to tend a fire that needed no tending. Oak. When she could speak again, she asked him the question she'd been asking herself since the slope. Why are you helping us? Oak. He didn't look up. Out here a body doesn't last long alone, he said. I know that better than most. He set another split of pine on the coals. What's your name, ma'am? Yours, I mean. Not just ma'am. Oak. Tabitha, she said. Tabitha Hale. Oak. The piece of pine stopped halfway to the fire. Oak. He set it down with a care that didn't match its weight. He turned, and the easy gentleness had gone out of his face, and something harder and more careful had come up underneath it, and his pale eyes searched hers like he was reading a brand. Oak. Hale, he said slowly, your man. Was he Daniel Hale off the spring claim at the canyon mouth down the Shields? Oak. Tabitha's breath caught. How could you possibly know that? Oak. Silas Mercer crossed the room to a chest at the foot of the cot, unlocked it with a key he wore on a thong at his neck, and took out something wrapped in oilcloth. He brought it back and put it in her hands, and when she folded back the cloth, she made a sound she didn't recognize as her own. Oak. It was Daniel's book, the little leather record book he'd written in at night with the lamp turned low, the one that was gone, that she'd torn the cabin apart hunting for, the one no man should have had. Oak. I found that the second week of November, Silas said quietly. Up high, off an old game trail near the head of the canyon, lying in the rocks like it'd been flung there, soaked through. Mile, maybe, from a fresh-turned slide where I'd heard a man had died. His jaw worked. I keep clear of the valley, I keep clear of all of it. But I picked the book up. Couldn't have told you why. Oak. Tabitha opened it with hands she could barely command. Daniel's small, neat figures filled page after page. And then near the back the writing changed, hurried, pressed hard into the paper. Dates. Brands that didn't match the bills of sale beside them. A list of cattle Greaves had bought cheap from rustlers and rebranded as his own. A note that the county man had been paid in the spring. Oak. And the deeds. Daniel had written it plain. Greaves had been forging quitclaims on 3 homesteads whose owners had moved on, except 2 of those men had not moved on anywhere a body could be found. Oak. And on the last written page, in a hand gone ragged, the ink dragging. Oak. If it comes to it, it was Greaves. The proof that hangs him is the patent and the second ledger, and I've put them where no man would think to look, where she keeps him war. Oak. The line stopped. The rest of the page was a long brown smear, dried dark. Oak. He was murdered, Tabitha said. The words came out flat and strange. She'd known it for 91 days. Seeing it in his own hand was a different kind of knowing, and it went through her like the cold had. Oak. Yes, ma'am, said Silas. And whoever did it is still hunting for what he hid. They didn't find the book because it went off the trail when. He stopped gentler. They didn't find it. But they're looking. A book like that's the rope around a man like Greaves's neck. Oak. For 3 days the storm sat down over the mountain and didn't move, and inside the heavy log walls a strange and fragile peace grew up among 4 people who'd had no plan to share a life. Oak. Lottie's color came back. By the second day she was sitting up gumming a strip of jerky and pulling herself along the bear hide after a wooden spoon, fat and indignant and alive, and every time Tabitha looked at her something in her chest unclenched another notch. Oak. Asa got his words back all at once and could not be stopped. He followed Silas everywhere, asking how a deadfall trap was set and why a marten's fur was worth more than a fox's, and whether the big man had ever fought a grizzly, to which Silas said no, and that any man who told you he'd fought a grizzly and won was either lying or stuffed. Oak. Pearl watched. She was her father's daughter, slow to give her trust, and she sat by the fire with her chin on her knees and observed the trapper the way a sentry watches a tree line. Oak. On the second evening Silas, without making anything of it, set a chunk of soft pine and a small knife in front of her, and showed her how to take the corner off it, how to cut away from herself, how to let the wood tell her where it wanted to go. And by the end of the night Pearl had the rough shape of a horse in her hands, and the sentry had quietly come off her watch. Oak. And Tabitha watched all of it with a knot in her throat. She had spent 91 days learning to read every man as a threat. The county clerk, the banksman, Greaves, with his easy smile, and here was the roughest-looking man she'd ever laid eyes on. A man who lived like the mountain had grown him, showing her children more plain fatherly kindness than they'd had since they'd lowered Daniel into the ground. Oak. On the third night, with the children asleep in a row of small breathing bundles by the fire, Silas set a cup of black chicory coffee in front of her and lowered himself into the chair across the table. And for a while neither of them said anything, and it was a comfortable kind of nothing. Oak. You don't sleep, he said finally. Oak. I see his face when I close my eyes, she said. Greaves, standing in my yard smiling at me, and now, she touched the book on the table, knowing he gave the order, and I'm sitting here as much use to my dead husband as a stone. Oak. You kept 3 children alive through 3 nights in an open camp in a Montana blizzard, Silas said. Stood up to a winter pack with a wagon jack. There's grown men I've known wouldn't have lasted the first night. He said it plainly, like a fact about the weather, and the plainness of it was what made her believe it. You're a lot of things, Mrs. Hale. Useless isn't one I'd put on the list. Oak. She felt the color come up in her face and was glad of the low light. Why do you live up here, Silas, alone in all this ice? Oak. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He looked into the fire and the old lines of his face deepened. Oak. I had a place once, he said. Small outfit east of here, in the breaks, wife. She was carrying our first when it happened. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his big hands. Man wanted my piece of ground, wanted it for a rail spur. I said no, same as your Daniel said no, I expect. He didn't argue with me. Oak. He just had his men run my stock off into the breaks one night, and throw a dam across my creek up where my line couldn't reach it, and he sat back and waited for the dry to do his arguing for him. His voice had gone flat, the way a thing goes flat when it has been worn smooth by handling. My wife took sick that summer. Fever. There was a doctor in town. But the man who wanted my land owned the man's debts, and the doctor wouldn't ride out, not for me, not for any homesteader who hadn't sold. I lost her and I lost the babe both in one night on the floor of a house I couldn't keep watered. He set the cup down. Local law called it the season. Hard country, they said. Folks die. The fire popped. Tabitha reached across the rough table and laid her hand over the scarred back of his. The man, she said softly, was it? Augustus Greaves, Silas said. The name fell into the room and sat there. He was younger then, Silas went on. Smaller. Hadn't yet bought up half the territory. But it was him. He looked at her hand on his, and slowly, carefully, he turned his own over and closed it around her fingers. I spent 2 years after she died doing things I won't tell you about, hunting the men he'd sent. By the time I was done, I wasn't fit to sit at a table with decent people, so I came up here and let the mountain have me. Told myself I'd never again let a living soul get close enough to cost me anything. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. Then I came down off my trapline 3 nights ago, and a little boy held his arms up to me. And now, she whispered. Now, said Silas Mercer, and whatever he meant to say after it never came, because Pearl sat straight up from her blankets, eyes wide in the firelight, and said, Mr. Silas, the dogs are crying. Silas went still. He had no dogs. He was up and moving before the girl finished, soundless for so large a man, sliding the bar across the door and crossing to the shuttered window. He set his eye to a knothole and looked out into the dark a long moment, and when he stepped back his whole bearing had changed. The gentleness gone, something cold and exact in its place. Wolves, he said low. But they're not singing at the moon, they're calling off horses. Riders, coming up the timber, slow, picking their way. He reached above the mantel and lifted down a long rifle, more than 2, coming careful. Tabitha was already gathering the children. How could they? When the snow let up day before yesterday, I went back down to your camp to fetch anything worth fetching, Silas said, sliding a heavy cartridge home with a single hard click. The canvas was gone. Somebody'd been there before me and dug it up. They cut my sign coming back uphill before the new snow buried it. His pale eyes found hers. They've come for the book, Tabitha. And for you, so there's no one left to say a word about either. She did not waste breath. He showed her a braided rug by the hearth, and under it a trapdoor and a black cold root cellar below with a low crawl space at the back end that ran out under the rock toward the creek. She handed her children down into the dark one by one, Pearl first to receive the others, then Asa, then the baby pressed into the boy's arms. You don't make a sound, she told them, her face close in the black. Not one, no matter what you hear up here. You hold each other and you wait for me. I am coming back for you. I have never once not come back for you. She kissed 3 foreheads in the dark and climbed out and dragged the rug across the trap, and a voice came booming up out of the snow. Mercer, we know you're up there. It was a voice like a rasp on iron. Silas had taken position beside the door, the rifle easy across his body, and he glanced at Tabitha and pointed her hard to the stone of the chimney, the thickest wall in the cabin, and she pressed her back against the warm masonry and stayed. That's Royce Hagen, Silas murmured. Greaves's range boss. He's killed before and slept fine after. Outside, hooves crunched as men spread to a half circle in the trees. Easy way or hard, Mercer. It's all the same to me, Hagen called. Send out the Hale woman and that book her husband stole, and we ride off and leave you to your furs. Make it hard and we leave you in the snow next to her. Mr. Greaves don't care which. He just wants the loose ends tied. Silas didn't answer. He had never been a man to spend words on people who'd already dug their own graves. He set his eye to the gun slit beside the door, leveled the long barrel, breathed out slow. Cover your ears, he said. The shot in that close space was a blow to the whole body, a slap of thunder that shook grit from the rafters. Outside a man screamed and a horse went mad, and there was a wild crashing as a rider hit the snow, and the spooked animal bolted into the dark. Light it up, Hagen shrieked. Pour it on him. Lead came through the night in a storm of its own. Slugs chewed the heavy logs, smacked into the chimney stone above Tabitha's head, sang off iron. She made herself small against the warm rock with her arms over her head, wood splinters raining down, and through the racket she watched Silas Mercer move like nothing she'd ever seen. Not fast exactly, but without a wasted motion, drifting from slit to slit. The long single shot traded now for a lever gun he worked in a steady murderous rhythm, and every time it spoke a yell or a scramble answered from the timber. But there were too many guns, and the cabin was one room, and a man can only stand at one wall at a time. How many? Tabitha called over the din. 4 left, I make it, Silas said, not turning. Maybe 5. He levered, fired, ducked as a return shot punched through the shutter where his head had been. Hagen's holding them back, working a flank. He wants behind us. That was when she remembered the crawl space. The low passage out the back of the cellar, the one that ran toward the creek. If Hagen's men found the creek mouth of it, found it before she got down there. Silas, she said, the cellar. There's a way out the back. It comes up by the water. His head came around. For 1 second he was not the trapper or the soldier. He was a man doing a hard sum and not liking the answer. Then they could come up into it, he said. Into the children. He moved without finishing the thought, crossing to the hearth in 3 strides, throwing the rug back, hauling the trapdoor up. Smoke from the fire and the gun haze sucked down into the dark. Pearl, he called down, low and even, the same voice he'd used on a frightened woman in a torn-up tent. It's Mr. Silas. I need you to bring the little ones up to me right now. Quick and quiet, girl, you can do it. They came up out of the dark coughing, 3 small shapes, and Silas folded a wet wool blanket. He'd soaked it in the water barrel in the time it took her to blink, over all 3 of them at once. We're not going out the door, he said to Tabitha. And we're not going down a hole with men coming up the other end of it. He went to the rear wall, behind the bulk of the chimney, and jammed an iron pry bar into the chinking between 2 great foundation stones, and he set his shoulder and his legs and pulled with a sound like the mountain itself groaning, and the stones grated and shifted and swung back on a frame, and behind them yawned a black square colder than the night, the mouth of an old prospect at it. A played-out diggings, the original builder had set his cabin against 80 years before. In, Silas said, now. He herded them through into the dark of the old working, struck a match and shielded it to a low candle stub, and pulled the false stone shut behind them just as the firing outside changed. Hagen's men, getting no answer, growing bold, rushing the cabin. From inside the rock, they heard the slab door go in, heard boots on the cabin floor, heard a man's confused shout, finding the room empty and the trapdoor open, and the cellar below it empty too. Silas led them up the old adit by candlelight. 100 yards of dripping stone and ancient timber, the children's faces white and silent, Tabitha's hand fisted in his coat. The passage bent and climbed, and at last gave onto a brushy slope above the creek, the snow thinning here under the spruce, and far below them and behind a ridge they could see a wash of yellow light where lanterns moved through the trees around the cabin. Stay here, Silas breathed, settling them in a tight stand of young spruce, the wet blanket over them, the candle pinched out. In the trees, low and quiet as the grave, whatever you hear. What are you going to do? Tabitha whispered, and caught his sleeve. Hagen thinks he's got us cornered in a burning hole, Silas said, and there was nothing warm in his voice now at all. He'll keep his men close to the lantern light, where it's safe, waiting on us to come out coughing. He looked down the slope toward the moving lights, and then, oddly, he looked off into the black timber to the north, where earlier the wolves had sung. But there's another hunter on this mountain tonight, he said, and it's hungry, and there's blood on this snow now, and I know how to walk where it walks. He took no rifle. A rifle was a sound that carried, a flash that marked you. He drew instead a long bone-handled knife, and he stepped off the slope into the dark, and the dark took him so completely that 1 second he was there, and the next Tabitha was looking at empty snow. She gathered her children under the spruce and pressed her hand over the baby's mouth and waited. What happened down in that timber she pieced together only later, partly from what Silas would say and partly from what Royce Hagen would swear to, weeping, in a Livingston courtroom in the spring. Hagen had 3 men left and a wolf pack circling at the edge of the lantern light, drawn by the dead horse and the smell of blood, and the men were nervous and the night was very dark. The first man went away from the fire to relieve himself and did not come back, and the only sign of him was a long drag mark in the snow that ran off into the trees. The second man, sent to find the first, called out once, And then there was a sound like a sack of grain dropped from a height, and then nothing. Oak. The wolves, by then, were close, gray shapes flickering just past the lantern's reach, and one of the horses screamed and broke its picket, and the third man fired wild into the dark at a thing he thought he saw, and hit one of the wolves, which made the rest of them worse. Oak. And out of that boiling dark a voice came that seemed to come from everywhere, low even, almost sorrowful, naming Royce Hagen's crimes back to him, one at a time, the men he'd killed, the homesteads he'd helped Greaves steal, Daniel Hale at the bottom of a shale slope. Oak. And then a shape rose up out of the snow at the edge of the firelight, huge and silent, and the last man between Hagen and that shape simply turned and ran. Straight into the dark, straight into the wolves, and his screaming did not last as long as you'd think. Oak. When it was done, Royce Hagen was on his knees by the dying lantern, with a knife at his throat, and the great mountain man crouched over him, and Hagen was babbling. Oak. You're going to ride to Livingston, Silas told him. Not to the county man, he's bought. To the territorial marshal, a man named Dunmore, and you're going to sit down and tell him every last thing Augustus Greaves paid you to do. Daniel Hale, the forged deeds, the 2 men nobody can find, all of it. And if you leave out one word, there is nowhere on this earth far enough that I won't come and find you, and next time I won't bring you a horse for the ride. He leaned close. Oak. You believe me, Hagen? Oak. I'll tell him, Hagen sobbed. God is my witness. I'll tell him everything, every word. Just keep them off me. Oak. Silas hauled him up by the collar, set him on the one horse that hadn't bolted, slapped it down the trail, and let the dark have him. Oak. When the man came back up the slope through the trees, Tabitha did not at first know him. She had the wagon jack handle again. She'd taken it up without thinking, and then she saw the set of those shoulders against the false dawn and dropped it and went to him through the snow, and he caught her and held on, and neither of them said anything for a long while because there was nothing that needed saying. Oak. By the time the sun came up gold over the crazies, the wolves were gone, and the snow had gone to glittering, and the cabin still stood, its 2 feet of roof snow untouched, smoke beginning to thread up again from the chimney where Silas built the fire back up and set the broth pot on to feed 3 exhausted children. Oak. Tabitha sat at the heavy table in the new light with Daniel's book open in front of her, reading and rereading the line that broke off in a smear of brown. Oak. Where she keeps him warm, she said. He was writing. Where she keeps him warm. He didn't finish it. Her eyes were wet and furious. He hid the proof, the real proof, the patent, and the second ledger, the things that hang Greaves, and he hid them where she keeps him warm. And I don't know what that means, Silas. She who keeps who? Oak. And then she stopped. Oak. Because Lottie had crawled up onto the bench beside her, dragging the thing she dragged everywhere, the thing Tabitha had clutched through 3 nights of cold and never once set down. The gray wool blanket Tabitha had pieced by hand before the baby was born, the blanket the baby slept in, was kept warm in every night of her small life. Oak. Where she keeps him warm. Oak. Tabitha's hands had begun to shake before her mind had finished the thought. She turned the blanket over and over again, running her fingers along the seams she had sewn herself, until she found one length of hem that was a little too stiff, a little too thick, the stitches a little neater than her own and newer. Daniel's clumsy, careful stitches, set in some night while she slept, over the lamp turned low. Oak. She picked the thread out with the point of Silas's knife. Folded flat inside the hem, oilcloth wrapped against the damp, was a second book thinner than the first. Names, dates, sums, a confession of a county bought wholesale, and folded with it the original land patent to the spring claim at the canyon mouth, stamped and witnessed at the Livingston Land Office, made out in the hand of Daniel Hale, free and clear and owing no man 1 red cent. Oak. She had carried the rope around Augustus Greaves's neck 3 nights through a blizzard, wrapped around her own sleeping child, and never known it. Daniel had hidden it in the one place no searching man would ever cut open, the one thing he knew his wife would never let out of her arms. Oak. He had saved them from the grave. He'd just had to die first to do it. Oak. She put her face down into the blanket and the smell of her baby, and she cried. And this time Silas Mercer did not turn away or pretend to tend the fire. He came and sat beside her and put one great arm around her, and the children gathered in against the both of them, and they stayed like that a long time while the light came up. Oak. It went the way such things go when the proof is good enough and the marshal is honest enough. Oak. Royce Hagan, true to his terror, talked, and the second ledger and the patent and Daniel's record book did the rest. And in the green and blooming spring a Livingston jury sat for 4 days, and then convicted Augustus Greaves of land fraud and of ordering the murder of Daniel Hale. And the man who had owned half a valley was hanged on a bright May morning with a county clerk and a bank man waiting their own turns in the next cell over. The spring claim came back to Tabitha clean. Greaves's lawyers tried and failed to muddy a patent stamped by the territory's own land office. She might have run cattle on it. Instead, she leased the water, fairly by the season, to the small outfits Greaves had spent 20 years trying to break. And the spring that he'd been willing to murder for kept every honest herd in the basin alive through the dry that came 2 summers on, and made her, quietly, a woman of some means. She did not stay in the canyon. There were too many ghosts at the mouth of it. She bought instead a long, low piece of bench land up the Shields with the mountains standing blue behind it, and built a house there with a wide porch and a door that she made sure could always be open from the inside. And on a warm Sunday in the 2nd June, Tabitha stood on that porch and watched Pearl chase Asa across the new grass with a pair of half-grown hounds boiling around their legs, and watched Lottie, fat and fierce and steady, on her feet now, ride high on the shoulders of a man in a clean cotton shirt who carried her like she weighed nothing and laughed a low rolling laugh that carried clear across the yard. Silas had cut his beard back and learned to abide a collar more or less. He still went up to the high country some weeks, to run a line and to be quiet, because a man who has been a mountain for 15 years does not stop being one all at once. But he always came back down before the light failed, and the children always heard his horse on the lane before Tabitha did, and ran. He came up the porch steps and set the baby down to run after her brother and sister, and he stepped in behind Tabitha and folded his arms around her and rested his chin on the top of her head, and for a while they just watched their children take the field apart. Quiet day, he said. It is, she said. She leaned back into him, into the solid, warm bulk of the man who had walked out of a blizzard into the worst night of her life, and she thought of canvas tearing in the dark and a torch streaming fire and a small boy lifting his arms to a stranger. We got our roof, Silas, she said. All of us, we got our roof. I keep coming back to the blanket. Tabitha carried the one thing that could save her family wrapped around her sleeping baby for 3 nights in a blizzard, and never knew it. Daniel sewed that proof into the hem some night while she slept, because he understood something simple and hard, that a man who sees trouble coming has to do the quiet, careful work before it arrives, not after. He didn't live to see how it ended. But that small, honest act in the dark is the reason his children grew up on a porch instead of in a county workhouse. That's how cause and effect really runs out here. The thing you do right when no one is watching becomes the thing that carries the people you love long after you're gone. I think about Tabitha standing in the torn mouth of that tent with a wagon jack in her hands, ready to die loud enough to buy her children 1 more minute. She had no money, no gun, no friend within 40 miles. What she had was a refusal to lie down, and that refusal is the only reason there was still a family alive for Silas to find. Nobody hands you a clean way out of the worst night of your life. You hold on through it, shaking and afraid, and you keep holding until the help comes. And sometimes that stubbornness is the entire difference between making it and not. And she was clear-headed in that storm, clearer than her own fear. She read the wolves by the gaps in the wind. She knew when running was foolish and when staying was death, and when a stranger offered a roof, she weighed him with her eyes open instead of trusting blind or refusing blind. That kind of judgment isn't something you're born with. It's what's left after you've been lied to enough times and you decide to keep thinking anyway. But the part I can't shake is Silas. He had every reason to climb back up that hill alone. He'd lost everything once to a man exactly like Greaves, and he'd built a whole life out of staying away from people. He didn't owe that family a thing. He helped anyway, because somewhere under all that scar tissue he'd kept the one thing that matters most. The plain decency to not let suffering happen in front of him when he had the power to stop it. That's the whole story, boiled down. Greaves had everything and lost it because greed eats the man who feeds it. Tabitha had nothing and kept her children because she wouldn't quit, kept her wits, and trusted the right man at the right hour. And a lonely trapper got his life back because he chose to be good when being good cost him his peace. We don't get to pick the night the storm comes. We only get to decide who we'll be while we're standing in it.